day 2 of the 15th annual GIS Day at the College of Staten Island. My name is Nora Santiago. I'm an urban policy analyst here at CSI. It is my honor to host this year's GIS Day event virtually. I hope many of you enjoyed yesterday's presentations. Today's presenter will discuss how racial divides defining geographies of opportunity in their school district, social justice issues, and New York City's transportation network, and the deep-rooted systemic racism. Today, we will continue with our amazing lineup of speakers from all over the US. I would like to just acknowledge the geography of our speakers and audience since it is a GIS event. Our speakers are presenting from their home state in New York, California, Washington, New Jersey, North Carolina. I also want to welcome our audience who are joining us from Hungary, Brazil, and Morocco. Don't you agree? This pandemic has really put CSI's GIS Day on the map. I'm so pleased to introduce our first speaker tonight, Robert Wallace. VP Wallace is our interim vice president of the Economic Development, Continuing Studies, and Government Relations. Prior to Rob's appointment to interim VP of Economic Development, he served as the college's legal counsel and chief of staff to President Fritz. Prior to joining us, VP Wallace served for 11 years as Assistant Commissioner for Investigations and Trials and Deputy General Counsel. So please join me in welcoming Vice President Robert Wallace.
Thank you, Nora, and thank you to everybody who's in attendance tonight. It's truly an honor to be here. And welcome to our second night of presentations related to the international celebration and recognition of GIS technology. It's a day or days, as the case may be here, to help inform people about the real-world applications of GIS that make a difference in society. With our participation tonight in our 15th GIS Day, we join other institutions of higher ed, government agencies, nonprofits, and GIS professionals to help understand and improve the world, or at least our little piece of it. As noted by Nora in the introduction, I previously had the honor of working at the greatest fire department in the world, the New York City Fire Department. And I was familiar with how the department applied GIS to improve response times to emergency medical calls, as well as to best respond to potential health crises facing the communities in our great city. I saw the real world impact of GIS in saving lives. What I did not appreciate at the time was how technology, real-time data, was being used to address sustainable development goals. Importantly, tonight we focus on how GIS can be and is used to increase awareness, understanding, and collaboration around racial inequities, and how GIS can assist in planning equitable allocations of resources. With that said, I'd like to start the program, but I first want to thank and acknowledge the accomplished speakers we had last night: Jeffrey Sachs, Esty Garrity, Dale Henderson, and Anika Pearson, as well as tonight's speakers, who I feel are as on par with last night's presentations. Our own Jonathan Peters, who I constantly get called about for requests for quotes regarding transportation issues. Veronica Velez from Western Washington University. Christine McNamara Watts, our GIS manager in Asheville, North Carolina. And two of our students, Aurora Collado and Luciana DiFrancesco. Lastly, I want to thank Nora Santiago, Ismail Hassan, and Jasmine Cardona for putting this together. It's an incredible event, and one that I'm glad we've continued. I also want to thank Dr. Fritz, president of our great institution, for continuing to support this event and other important events on the campus. Lastly, I want to thank you all for tuning in. Obviously, this is an important event, not only at CSI, but around the world. And your presence here acknowledges it and helps spread it and helps it continue. Thank you and enjoy the show.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you for supporting GIS Day and all the sustainability initiatives that we have on our campus. So before we continue with the program, I just want to share some of the housekeeping rules. As you probably noticed, everyone is muted except the speakers. After the presentations, you will have the chance to ask questions. What I'm asking you to do is to put your questions during the presentations into the chat. Just send it to my name and I will call as many questions as I can. I'm so pleased and honored to introduce our today's first presenter, Dr. Veronica N. Velez. Professor Velez is an associate professor in secondary education and founding director of Western Washington University Education and Social Justice minor. Her research focuses on Latinx immigrant, migrant mother activists, community-based participatory action research in grassroots contexts, popular education, and reimagining cartographic tools for movement building and critical inquiry. Dr. Velez is featured in the second volume of Esri Press's Women in GIS, Mapping Their Stories. In addition, she has published in multiple academic journals, including Educational Forum, Harvard Educational Review, the High School Journal, Association of Mexican American Educators Journal, Educational Foundation, Seattle University Journal for Social Justice, Contemporary Justice Review, and Race, Ethnicity, and Education, and has contributed to several chapters to edited anthologies. She is also a National Academies Ford Foundation Fellow and the Faculty Fellow with the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education, and previously a Spencer Foundation Research Training Grant Fellow. Please welcome Professor Veronica Velez.
Thank you, Nora. So I'm excited to be here, and I'm just so privileged and humbled for the invitation. I especially want to thank you, Nora, for the invitation to be a part of this event. I always get excited because I feel like in our world of education, we don't get to nerd out on GIS. So when I can make new GIS homies, I'm like so down. So I'm just really privileged to be a part of this wonderful space. So thank you again. So I wanted to start by just giving you a little bit of the history of my development of critical race spatial analysis and some context for the work. And I'm trying to be brief here. As you know, some academics, we can go off and just keep going. So I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. So my work to develop critical race spatial analysis together with my mentor, Dr. Daniel Tolorzano at UCLA, stems from an interest in the relationship between space, race, and educational opportunity, and how GIS in particular can help us explore and visualize that relationship. In other words, how can we use GIS to examine and remedy uneven geographies of opportunity that are found in the communities and schools we serve, while at the same time radicalize this tool as much more than a technology that can display the physical aspects of space. So for me, this work is deeply personal. My introduction to GIS occurred while I was a grassroots community organizer working with Latinx migrant families. In our collaborative efforts, we struggled to make visible the needs and concerns of communities often rendered invisible by how we perceive particular places. This is true of my hometown of Pasadena, California. If you know of anything of Pasadena, probably the first things that come up is the Rose Bowl and the Rose Parade. And those are the usual markers, right? A nice, affluent Los Angeles suburb by most accounts. But if you imagine a place that is home to a large community of Latinx immigrant families, the project I will share with you today centers on this place, the concerns that Latinx parent leaders in that community have around equitable access to resources and supports for their children, and embodies a deep passion to find and in many cases reclaim tools like GIS to better aid us in efforts of spatial and racial justice. But let me start by sharing a little bit about why space is important to me. In particular, why it is important to examine space more centrally in the work of educational researchers, practitioners, and leaders. So take, for example, Oakland, California. Let's say you live in or around the port of Oakland. Chances are that you're likely to be Black, low income, and that your child is likely to suffer from asthma. There's been a significant body of work that links diesel exhaust to a range of poor health outcomes. Children that live in West Oakland, which borders the ports, are 7 times more likely than other children in California to be hospitalized due to asthma-related conditions. And my work as a postdoctoral researcher at UC Berkeley in 2012, in collaboration with Oakland Unified, not only did this issue surface as a matter of public health, but also a matter of grave educational concern, as children who reside in West Oakland often miss school for asthma-related issues. And because this is affecting a concentrated neighborhood of Black and low-income Oakland residents, it has become an interlinked racial and environmental justice issue. So a public health report issued at the time explored this very issue and concluded that for Oakland, the geographic distribution of death and disease was both race and classed, the results of housing and social policy decisions that contributed to a higher concentration of Blacks and Latinos by the ports. Because my training is rooted in critical race theory, which understands the conditions of our everyday life to be mediated by the ways racism and white supremacy, more specifically, have been built into the policies and laws that govern society, when I read a report like this, I had to ask, how does race and racism affect a community's sense of mobility and inform their conditions of possibility through schools, public health, or other institutions? How are social forces like racism mapped onto landscapes and people in ways and in what ways can GIS help to make evident those forces as they become mechanisms of our everyday, the fabric of how studies are organized, and even more specifically, how we teach our children? So in the last 10 years or so, colleagues of mine, not very many, but a few colleagues of mine have taken up this task and have asked these questions. Many of them, in fact, have used GIS to explore and visualize what we commonly refer to as opportunities to learn. Much of this effort arose to challenge how student performance was being measured, traditionally through the use of high-stakes tests, in which limited outcomes have come to represent appropriate goals for all students. The proposed accountability uses of outcome indicators to administer sanctions and incentives based on individual student performance presume an educational system that provides adequate human and material resources to ensure a fair opportunity for students to achieve these outcomes. In other words, it assumes that all students have access to appropriate and sufficient materials, adequate buildings, and qualified teachers, and so forth. The move to looking at opportunity gaps rather than achievement gaps has led to an increase in the use of GIS to examine the inequitable distribution of educational resources across space, and to use GIS to visualize distribution patterns and share those findings with schools, parents, youth, and community organizations. Now, William Tate is a prominent critical race theorist in our field, began to use the term geography of opportunity to frame this inquiry and consider the role of GIS as a visual political literacy project, capable of engaging critical dialogue across numerous stakeholders and building capacity toward change. He saw GIS as a methodological engine to jumpstart and support community mobilization. So Tate's work was very important for me because it helped us to create a platform to begin to think about critical race spatial analysis. But before I began developing the framework, I asked myself 3 questions. The first was, in what ways can educational researchers benefit from a geographic spatial analysis? Second, how can GIS specifically be used as a methodological and conceptual tool for spatially analyzing the role of race and racism as it connects to schools and educational opportunity or lack thereof? And what pedagogical possibilities does GIS hold for teaching and learning about educational opportunity and racial justice? Now, I was asking these questions while a full-time grassroots organizer in my hometown of Pasadena, which is the map that you see here in front of you. And I was determined to put my emerging GIS skills to use to benefit the efforts of a grassroots organization led by migrant mothers in my hometown. They immediately had an idea for how to use GIS, and the following maps that I'm going to share with you is what emerged from that process. So the map in front of you is a map of PUSD, in short for Pasadena Unified, and it's comprised of 3 cities, Altadena, Pasadena, and Sierra Madre. And we're located in the San Gabriel Valley, kind of like eastern, northeast Los Angeles County at the base of the San Gabriel Mountains. Now, it was important to the mothers I was organizing with to define what they considered to be the Latinx neighborhood within PUSD, which is what you see on this map. Because most mainstream accounts of the region tend to erase the prominence of the Latinx community, they wanted to ensure that the neighborhood was clearly marked and informed by their everyday lives in Pasadena. So this area is known by local residents as the Northwest neighborhood. The next step in the process was to show demographically that this region was home to a thriving Latinx community and has been so for decades. So these maps show that since the 1940s, the Latinx residents have been growing within this Northwest section of the city. And I'm looking forward to creating the 2020 map using the decennial census. But here you can see in 2010 that this Northwest neighborhood is indeed a predominantly Latinx neighborhood in our region. Next, we wanted to show a relationship that highlights the disproportionate impact of structural conditions for Latinx residents living in this area. I drew from a report published by the Annie Casey Foundation titled, "The Growing Number of Kids in Severely Distressed Neighborhoods, Evidence from the 2000 Census," which identified 4 indicators as a good measure of poverty. These included the number of residents living below the poverty line, the number of female-headed households with children, the number of individuals with less than a high school education, and the number of workforce males who are unemployed. I created an index to GIS with a 0.25 weight and conducted a hotspot analysis. I was all excited because I'm like, look, I can do some GIS, and I felt really fancy in my tools, right? But I returned to the mothers proud only to find a set of concerned faces at this map. Though this map had revealed a concentration of poverty in the most dense Latinx neighborhood in the region, the data sources attributed poverty to individuals, not structural conditions, and thereby contributed to a problematic discourse in which the family unit, in this case the Latinx family unit, was a transmitter of deficiencies. The mother's critique was an important first step in helping me realize that the construction of GIS maps had to be deeply attuned to the ways that data sources may inadvertently contribute to racist narratives. Producing maps that failed to underscore causality for the material realities, like poverty, that disproportionately affect Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and other communities of color. So the next step was to turn our focus to explore whether GIS could help us address 2 important questions. The first was whether there was a relationship between where Latinx students lived, the types of opportunities they were afforded in schools, and if so, what does that relationship look like? And second, what do these findings reveal about the quality of schools in the Northwest neighborhood, the most densely populated Latinx area in the region? So to start, I consulted with analysts of PUSD who were using a very early version of GIS. This is before we were still working with databases. More on this later, people have questions. But to understand, these changes within the district. So this map was done by a PUSD cartographer. And I was blown away because it shows powerfully something that I was not expecting. As he shared with me, 85% of the student population across the district was comprised of students coming from this Northwest region. That caused me and the mothers to kind of scratch our head a bit. If 85% come from this Northwest area, which is predominantly Latinx, what about all the white kids? Could it be that Pasadena is a community of solely old white people? That didn't seem to make sense given what we knew at the ground level of who lived in the city. We thought about another alternative. Maybe we needed to look at the private school population and demographics. So as this slide shows, in a side-by-side comparison within the same district boundaries that define PUSD, which operates 25 schools, the region is also home to 82 private schools. It is also worth noting that at the same time we were conducting this project, 4 public schools in PUSD were being targeted for closure because there weren't enough children to fill public school seats. PUSD continues to hold the unique distinction of the school district with the highest concentration of private schools based on size compared to any other school district in the US. When we looked into these schools, it also became clear that there was a racial divide in attendance. We mapped the distribution of white students across both systems. And what we found was that white children made up 14% of the public school population, but 93% of the private school population. I returned with these maps to the mothers who began to see the racialized story of schooling in PUSD as one that they already intimately knew and often shared with school district officials, only to be dismissed as anecdotal, or the single story of a disgruntled parent about their child's schooling. They understood the profound consequential geographies that had been shaped as a result of a school district that had become predominantly Black and brown, and a private school system that had become predominantly white. They understood the connection between this reality and the divestment of public school funds to support the privatization of schooling in that region. But for them, it wasn't sufficient to simply show a racialized distribution of resources. They wanted to visualize how this was a result of racist structural conditions. So next, we mapped the founding dates of these private schools. And what we found was that 69% of Pasadena's private schools were founded between 1964 and 1976. This can be traced directly to the landmark case of Jackson v. Pasadena in 1963. Pasadena holds the dubious distinction of being the first non-Southern city ordered by federal courts to desegregate its public school system. As it turns out, more than 2/3 of the private schools were founded during the 5-year period during which Pasadena was undergoing desegregation through mandated busing. What we have appeared to discover is a strong indication of white flight. But unlike other school districts where whites fled the area, white families instead created their own school system. The mothers also insisted that inequities were occurring within the public schools, not just across the public and private domains of schooling. These signaled to me that I needed to change my scale in mapping educational inequities. Rather than look at the Northwest neighborhood as a point of reference for analysis, that maybe we needed to look at access to educational opportunities within schools. At that suggestion, one of the mothers offered the idea of looking at gifted and talented education programs, also known as GATE. These were specialized programs within public schools that often benefited from the most well-resourced classrooms taught by the most qualified teachers. One of the mothers had been struggling for a long time to get her child enrolled. So we decided to look at the elementary schools in which the mothers have children, which is what you see in this map. So this map shows that those elementary schools and the overall distribution of white and Latinx students at each of those schools. But this next slide shows very clearly, so this enrollment, the distribution of white and Latinx students in GATE programs, that when you compare the two, it's clear that PUSD being predominantly a district that serves students of color, but that students of color were being locked out of the few highly resourced programs within these public schools. This is commonly known in our field as a school within a school phenomena. That while a diverse group of students may enter the same building, the opportunities or lack thereof that they have access to inside are largely determined by race and ethnicity. So this project was central to our development of critical race spatial analysis. So these mothers engaged GIS to tell counter-cartographic narratives about the racial divides or color lines defining geographies of opportunity in their school district. Although exploratory data analysis, which is quantitatively driven, was initially used in the development of the maps, it was the mother's intimate knowledge of the community and collaborative analysis in the process of map making that was key. By rooting the analytical capabilities of GIS in their own lived experience, the mothers drove an iterative inquiry that led to the building of a counter-cartographic narrative that spoke back to the post-racial divide or post-racial discourse that was taking hold of school reform. In taking and appropriating GIS as a community-based praxis, the mothers ground truth the maps, making visible spaces and spatial relationships that otherwise would go unnoticed. So they transformed the power of the maps to rest not in their GIS displays of data, but in the weaving of a spatial narrative that linked their current efforts to historical struggles for educational equity. So informed by this project, I wanted to offer these very quickly, these few tenets that define what critical race spatial analysis, or CRSA, has come to mean in our work. So the first is a recognition that race and racism are endemic and permanent in US society. Discussions of race must begin with an examination of how race has been socially constructed in US history and how the system of racism functions to oppress. While it centralizes race, it also focuses on racism's intersections with other forms of subordination, based on gender, class, sexuality, language, culture, immigration status, phenotype, accent, and so forth, to name a few. So conducting a critical race spatial analysis requires that we foreground the color line, to use the famous phrase coined by W.B. Du Bois in 1903, where he asserts that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Second, critical race spatial analysis asserts that traditional claims of race, neutrality, and objectivity act as a camouflage for the self-interest, power, and privilege of dominant groups in US society. CRSA challenges claims that the educational system offers objectivity, meritocracy, colorblindness, race neutrality, and equal opportunity. We question approaches to schooling that pretend to be neutral or standardized, while implicitly privileging white, US-born, monolingual, English-speaking students. Thus, critical race spatial analysis challenges race-neutral representations of space by exposing how racism operates to construct space in ways that limit opportunity for students of color, their families, and communities. Third, critical race spatial analysis finds that experiential or everyday knowledge of people of color find that knowledge to be legitimate, appropriate, and critical to understanding, analyzing, and teaching about racial subordination. This challenges us to consider what types of data are we using to generate GIS maps. For example, how are we approaching geographic visualizations that integrate the subjectivity and positionality of the communities we are spatially studying? How are we refusing the same mistakes I made when I produced the hotspot map I shared earlier that can perpetuate racist depictions of communities when we aren't considering the limitations of our data sources? Fourth, CRSA is deeply committed to advancing a social justice agenda in schools and society. It acknowledges schools as political places and teaching as a political act. Thus, it is committed to reimagining GIS as a tool capable of supporting political projects that end subordination and further movement building among oppressed groups to transform society. Fifth, we operate from a transdisciplinary knowledge base. So we go beyond disciplinary boundaries to draw on multiple methods to listen to and learn from these knowledges otherwise silenced by popular discourse and academic research. And lastly, CRSA emphasizes maps and map making as a point of departure for analyzing the relationship between race and space, and refuses to allow maps to speak from themselves. Maps can't always tell you why things happen in space. They require that we frame our understanding of the visualizations we produce through a critical analysis that recognizes the importance of the relationship between people, places, and power. So in sum, and this is my last slide, what we're offering here is a critical race spatial analysis praxis. And this requires that we consider how these tenets factor into each of the steps of constructing GIS maps, from identifying and mining data, determining boundaries, drawing from local expertise, engaging in spatial analysis, and producing a cartographic narrative. And similar to the work I shared with the mothers, each new map engages an iterative process of reflexivity, where the map maker is constantly assessing whether the maps and the methods used to produce them are not simply displaying race in space, but actively working toward dismantling racism. Though it's still a work in progress, I do believe that critical race spatial analysis has the potential to engage GIS in more radical efforts to build spatial models of the world from the lived experiences of people of color, and in doing so, moving us toward racial justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Velez. That was very interesting. I love this presentation. We learned so much. So as I mentioned, this is the time to ask questions. So if you guys have a question for Professor Velez, you can just type it in the chat and I'm happy to read it out. Just send it to me, Nora Santiago. Let me see what we got so far. Given specific examples cited, what recommendations can you make to GIS accessible to the community?
I just put myself on mute. I can tell you that one of the things that was really interesting for me, and I'll be brief here, when I was organizing, we had the space that was shared by multiple grassroots organizations. It was called La Casita, or the Little House, right? That was basically based in Pasadena, that was donated by a very wealthy benefactor for grassroots organizations to use for their efforts. And there were several computers. And I was a doctoral student at the time when we were doing some of this mapping work. And at the time, there used to be this book. I remember it was called, it was like Introduction to GIS. It was a green book. It was ARC, GIS. I think it was 9.3 was the version. It was an older version. And in it, it had like a 60-day or no, 180-day trial version of the software. So I bought like 6 copies. And Vettel just like loaded that into the lab. And then when it expired, I would buy 6 more copies, right? So that we would have this, because I couldn't afford the license, but I could afford the book with the trial version. And one of the things that was really important to me, even though I held the tool, I really thought it was valuable for the mothers to consider cartography as part of their organizing efforts. But it wasn't an easy thing. It's not like there's an institutional process. It becomes the individual efforts of people to say, I'm going to do this and I'm going to buy 6 copies of the book, which is not sustainable. So, but to think about these efforts, I think for me, helped me to understand that we have such cartographic wisdom in our communities, often communities who are deemed not to be wise because they didn't go into higher ed or they're not part of the educational process, but have so much to offer in terms of their spatial knowledge. So I think part of the conversation here is how do we figure out a way to get this tool and the training behind it into the hands of young people and community members? And I think that's been a quest of mine to figure that out. And I know that Esri and other companies are trying to figure this out too, but the software is mainly very inaccessible. So I think it's a question that we have to continue to wrestle with. I know we have public platforms and other sort of public GIS software, but nonetheless, I think we're still challenged to figure out how to do this. So I kind of pose it as I'm struggling alongside many of you all who are thinking about these same questions, and that's part of my work.
Yeah, I agree. And I see now they're starting teaching GIS in high school and even middle school. And here at CSI, we always try to reach out and connect with schools in our network to introduce them to the technology because it's so important.
Absolutely.
Let me get the next question. Are you familiar with radical cartography's participatory mapping work in Latin and South America? And has it informed any of your work?
I'm just starting to get, it's really interesting. So I'm trained in critical race theory. That's sort of my formal training and in the field of education. And we tend to be very US specific, which is a problem. It's the first thing, I'm the first one to critique my own training, right? CRT, because it's really looking at US legal institutions, and that has been a lot of what we then stem to look at what has happened in, you know, post-civil rights era and how racism continues. So admittedly, much of my focus has been US based. About 5 years ago, as we began to we're thinking about the next iteration, particularly around ground truthing, which is sort of this idea that I've been playing with for a while to think through. I've been expanding that reach. And so I've been looking into some of these projects from Latin America, but also South Africa has some really interesting work. New Zealand, Canada has been using GIS in these really interesting ways. And so I think we have to, if we want to radicalize this tool, let's not reinvent the wheel. There are people who are already doing this, who are thinking about this. And the question is, how do we come together to learn from each other? So I would say that my introduction to some of that work is pretty recent, and it's beginning to shape how I think about tactical cartography, subversive, there's different ways that different terms that we're using, but also how an international lens expands our reach to think about, more radical approaches to this work.
Absolutely. I got one more question. Do you feel that there are not many females in your field of study? If so, what supports do you feel are valuable to assisting students that are enrolled in a program that are non-traditional for their gender?
Yeah, that's, it's interesting because I was a little shocked when I got the invitation to be part of Esri Press's Women in GIS, because I actually have a really interesting, journey to this work. I'm a sort of an accidental professor. This wasn't supposed to happen. So like, Vero was nearly failed out of undergrad. So I always tell my students this, like, I was trying to do engineering. I'm a daughter of immigrant parents, and engineering and math was always really big in my home. And apparently I sucked at it, right, as an undergrad. It was one of these things where I was so bad at it. And I stuck with it though. And I thought, I don't want to lose my love of math and science, but I was really struggling, and for lots of different reasons. But I also, not only was I sometimes the only, person of color in my classes, and I'm a very light-skinned, admittedly light-skinned Chicana, but I was also the only woman in my classes, in these science classes. And so I left the field, ended up going into psychology, largely to understand what was wrong with me and why I couldn't get my stuff together. And then went into organizing right after, and did that for 15 years. So when I began to think about coming back to school, I didn't want to touch math or science or anything technical with a 10-foot pole. And I had a mentor who saw that who was trying to help me kind of heal from my undergrad wounds, and invited me to continue on to a PhD, which in a million years I would have never imagined, and said, you should take a GIS course. And through GIS, I fell in love with math and science again. And I had beautiful mentors of color, beautiful women and femme mentors that really brought me into the fold and allowed me to see myself in this work, to see the application. But it wasn't until I started organizing with the mothers that I was like, oh, this can actually be an important movement building tool. Like, we can actually use this for change. And when I began to see that, I got really excited about it. And sort of my love of math and science returned, just differently, right? And I got to kind of re-explore statistical modeling and do geographic weighted regressions, and beginning to think about but it happened through a very different approach. So I think part of it is that we need collectives. I always say that the work of justice is the work of building collectives, diverse collectives in which we can see ourselves in the work. Had it not been for those mentors, I would have never had even thought about GIS again. I was so wounded from my undergrad experience. So I'm really grateful that I had representative mentors that looked like me, that sounded like me, that were from my community, that said, yeah, we can use this, we can do this. And I know it sounds cheesy, but it really matters.
It sure does. Yeah, absolutely. I remember my undergrad years. Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Professor Velez. I hope you can stay around and listen to the other presentations. Thank you. I am so pleased and honored to introduce our next speaker, CSI's Jonathan Peters. Jonathan Peters is a professor of finance and data analytics in the Accounting and Finance Department in Lucille and J. Chesanoff School of Business at the College of Staten Island, the City University of New York. He is also a member of the doctoral faculty in the PhD program in the Economics and the Earth and Environmental Science at the CUNY Graduate School, and is a research fellow at the University Transportation Research Center at the City College of New York. Peters has and is serving as an expert on panels at the National Academy of Sciences, and is a subject matter expert in the areas of transportation finance, social justice, and road pricing. He's a member of the Congestion Pricing Committee and the Trucking Research Committee at the Transportation Research Board. He currently serves as a chair of the Economics of Pricing Joint Subcommittee at the Transportation Research Board. He's currently conducts research in the areas of regional planning, road and mass transit financing, corporate and public sector performance metrics, social justice, capital cost, and performance management. He has recently published the Transportation Research, the Journal of Public Transportation, and the Transportation Research Record of the National Academies of Sciences. John and I have been working together for over 13 years, and he has always been here to support GIS Day. Actually, him and Professor Benamoff are the professors who started the very first GIS Day here at CSI 15 years ago. John and I produced hundreds of maps on various topics over the years, and he published in many academic journals. John learned to use GIS over the years, pretty much on his own. He only came to me a few times for advice. Over the summer, he learned how to use LiDAR data, which I never used before. So now I'm learning new GIS skills from him. Please welcome Professor Jonathan Peters.
Thanks, Nora. Thanks so much for everybody. If everybody's hearing me. Are my slides sharing? Let's see, my slides should be sharing. Are you seeing my slides? All right. How's everybody this evening? It's great to be here. Thank you, Nora, for the introduction. My bio is way too long. Has everybody seen my slides? We good? Nora? Yes? Okay, great. So thanks for everybody coming out tonight and joining us for GIS Day. I'm going to follow up with Veronica on her topics that she already covered a bunch of it, but obviously I have a focus on social justice in the United States. And as Professor Velez is exactly correct to point out, you tend to have a tremendous amount of interest in the legal system, because I'm going to talk to you about how GIS can be used to support and understand social equity issues, and how do you measure it. And that's an important thing. I'm going to reference my co-authors, Dave King out at Arizona State, Cameron Gordon at Australian National, and Nora Santiago, obviously at GIS. So yesterday, Professor Sachs laid out a broad range of issues about climate change and social justice. And I guess I'm coming back today as kind of the contrast point of that, because obviously he pointed to a world of the future where there'd be technology and opportunities to address our challenges. However, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how far we have to go. And it's a little bit daunting when you actually do it. And I've been working in this area for a bunch of years, and it's hard. I know that Professor Velez, I'm sure she would say it's a long, hard struggle to move forward and get anything done that you feel that you've made an accomplishment or made some sort of progress. One of the things I'm going to talk about today about is economic opportunity, and it's really important in terms of social justice, which is what is a good job? Can you get to one? How are you going to get there? And how much does it cost? And how long does it take? And these are critical issues. I'm sure, Professor Velez, right? You've seen this in Latino families that getting to work and back from work for family matters is a huge issue for low-income households. So I have this classic graph. When we talk about transportation, you wake up in the morning and you're going to go to work. And there's a lot of different ways you can go. You might walk, you might bike. I mean, a lot of areas are not very friendly to biking or walking. So then you're kind of stuck with mass transit, which can be pretty poor in a lot of neighborhoods in terms of the quality. You might be lucky and have a subway or some sort of heavy rail line or commuter rail system. They can be expensive. Or you might drive. And I do a lot of work on toll roads, and I'll show you a little bit of my work today on that, about how it could impact low-income households. But of course, I drove this map, I did this diagram a couple of years ago, and what really happens is when you think about it nowadays, a lot more things are happening. And Professor Sachs was talking about it. And, there are going to be new opportunities here. Things like shared ride travel with things like Lyft and Uber. People are using these scooters all over the place, e-bikes, autonomous vehicles may come at us. But again, there's still the same questions hanging around, which is, how is it going to help us in terms of social justice and equity, and how are low-income households going to be able to get to and from their needed facilities and jobs and such? So everything we do has consequences. Professor Sachs is talking about us all telecommuting. Well, I don't know, home health care aides are probably still going to have to go to their sites for work, and there's a lot of jobs that require your physical presence. But obviously, there's questions about how you're going to get there, and there's many different ways we can get to work. But obviously, this is probably one of the biggest social justice tools in America. This is what we call a beater, which is a basic car, And everybody thinks about the high-end market. And a lot of people, you know, when you talk to people about social justice and all, they talk about building mass transit. And the problem with that is it's hard to serve many areas, and it's also hard to get to many jobs. Whereas this kind of a vehicle, a low-priced, worn-out, basic vehicle, can provide a massive amount of mobility in America. And if you don't have a car, it's a massive difference in your opportunity set in terms of where you can get to jobs. So everybody talks about this, and if you talk to Mr. Sachs yesterday, you know, I poked him yesterday, and I said, you know, this is what we've built. Anybody know what this is? This is the Second Avenue subway, which is beautiful and wonderful. Instead of this, nobody wants to talk about this. This is not what everybody wants to talk about the future being, is a bunch of beater cars. They want to talk about building these great subways. And the challenge is that this is the Second Avenue subway in Manhattan, and we built phase 1 there. And I'll talk a little bit more about phase 1, but I'm particularly troubled by the choices that were made by our transportation planners and our policy people. And it talks a lot, you know, Professor Velez talked a lot about structural problems in our system. And I'm going to come right back to that one because how did this get picked? And this is really funny because, not ha-ha funny, just unpleasantly funny. This project is eating a tremendous amount of our capital dollars in terms of transportation expansion in New York City. And obviously it represents a real major choice. So I'm a quantitative person. I'm a business analyst. I'm an economist by training. I teach in data analytics and in finance. And so I'm a quantitative social justice researcher. I'm not really going to talk to you about the problems. I'm not really going to get involved with it. My job is measurement. And measurement is key because measurement allows us to see what is going on. And once you see what's going on, if you can't measure it, you can't fix it. Because when you show up with these problems or these issues, people are going to say, show me, prove it. A lot of people in this game, I don't know how, Professor Velez, I don't know if you found this, but a lot of people don't even want to talk about it. Let's not even talk about this. Why don't you just go home? Why don't you just stop talking about these problems that we have in our society? It would be solved if you would just go away. So I've been fighting this for a bunch of years, and I'm a quantitative person, and my attack is to always get the information that gives people the weapons, the armaments that will help them fight this fight, okay? So I've been involved in court cases. I've actually worked on a case I'll talk briefly about later, about we actually beat the MTA back on a social justice question, which is a very rare thing to actually win against a transit system. So why transportation? It's one of the important things you have in terms of getting to and from jobs, getting access to healthcare, getting access to political systems, getting access to all sorts of resources in our society. And Dave King, my co-author, just has recently written a paper that basically points out, when you look at the actual data, that having a car is more valuable than having a college education. We're about the same in most of America. So if you have a college education, we all aspire, let's get everybody a college education. If you have a college education or you have a car, you get about the same economic opportunities. Why? Because your set of opportunities, where you can work, is so much greater with the car as opposed to where you can work without a car. He did study, and we actually, amazingly enough, Staten Island made the abstract because it's the one borough in New York City where having a car counts. The rest of New York City, you can get away with not having a car. This is one of the few places in America where you can get away with not owning a vehicle, but in Staten Island still counts. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the problems we have. So for instance, this is an example of a real problem. This is the brand new Goethals Bridge, which is right near the College of Staten Island. It's built by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. It's a $1.5 billion project, and it has no transit on it. And it's a toll facility with a very high toll. So if you're a low-wage worker who want to work, say, at the airport, at the Port of Newark or New Jersey, this can be a rather significant barrier to you getting to and from work. And I filed against the Port Authority in an environmental justice claim in their environmental impact statement to get transit onto the bridge. And the government ignored me. The US federal government ignored me. And this shows you the level of problems we have in our systems, okay? Now, one of the things you're going to be hit with when you try to do this kind of work is that if you say discrimination, the first thing you're going to be told is prove it, because you might have to go to court for this. And the second thing, you're going to need data. So for instance, this is one of our metrics that we use to try and figure out whether or not there is discrimination. This is called a disproportionate effect index, which basically takes a look at the impacted area versus the non-impacted area and sees whether or not there's too much of the bad stuff. See, there's two different types of justice in this game, right? Which is, you're deprived. Professor Velez was talking about the good stuff of education. But there's also, she also hit on the pollution aspects, because pollution is a major problem. So that's, you don't want to give the poor people too much pollution. You don't want to give them the bads, too much bads, or too little goods, and both can be environmental justice issues. And I'm going to point to Dr. King, Martin Luther King, because he wrote on this. His last published article actually he published in 1969 after he had already been murdered. He hit it on the head. He hit the nail on the head in terms of what was the issue. And he said, because the layout of rapid transit systems determines the accessibility of jobs to the African American community. And if you look at his whole quote, I have the whole quote here. He's very nuanced. He had a very nuanced view of the situation, which was, it's the layout. Once you design it, you can't, it's going to run for 30, 50, 100 years the way it was designed. If you mess it up in the design phase, the communities that are impacted for generations. And obviously the second line, which is actually even more important, the system has virtually no consideration for connecting the poor people with jobs, their jobs. There's only one explanation for the situation, and that is a racist blindness of city planners. And that's an amazingly insightful comment, which unfortunately we're still fighting with today, because once the system is laid out, they run it the way it is. Still going on today. This is Wired Magazine. Transportation is a civil rights issue. So whenever we talk about transportation policy, you know, there's a lot of questions that go on. And then one of the things is, what are you going to build? What infrastructure to build? Who gets the infrastructure? Who should pay for it? Are we fair in terms of quality of service, fees, you know, and how do you measure unfair? That's always a good question. When you talk to the engineers out there, let's realize that you start off engineering, right? The engineers tend to lean on efficiency. They like to be efficient, but there's two metrics of performance. One is efficiency and one is equity. So you can build a very efficient system that's very inequitable. You can build a very equitable system that's very inefficient. But the engineers tend to go off the rails onto efficiency, saying they want to move the most number of people, and that's the key metric. And you can't just go that way. You have to look at equity as part of the game. Now, I'm going to just talk briefly about the policies here, and if you want to talk later, everybody wants to ask me questions about it. But the reality is that the United States has an ugly base at the core of the Constitution, which was the history of slavery. The Constitution embodies whether or not you're a citizen and a non-citizen. If you're not a citizen in the United States, you don't get rights, and that's part of the whole game. So a lot of our assumptions in the United States are race-based, when focusing on minority populations and ethnic groups. You go to Europe, they'll talk a lot about social inclusion. It's more about income. It's more about other things. They'll claim they don't have racial problems, but I think that's ridiculous, but they do. But there's also concerns in social justice for the poor, the elderly, disabled, okay? So those things are going to crop up in terms of what you're looking to see as inequality. And again, back to the US Constitution, when citizenship was denied to African Americans, and that sets the whole game. So when we talk about our rights, we're going to come back to what's a citizen, what civil rights do you have, what are the rights to transportation, and obviously how has our policy evolved. And there's basically three main things we look at. And if I'm going to be looking to pursue a case, in one case, you might have some states' rights that might help you too. But the big guns are the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Title VI. The Executive Order 12898 of the President in 1994, President Clinton signed a rule that basically forced social justice analysis into other areas. And then you may have some states' protections, like in other words, we sued under New York State civil rights law. The other thing is ADA, American with Disabilities Act, and provides us also with some protections that may be utilized in terms of deciding who needs to be protected. So we're going to have to go test whether or not you've had an inequality or you've been unfairly treated. And obviously one of the challenges is you have to have standing. I don't know if you've met this festival, but you know, sometimes you'll run into a situation where you come in and say, hey, wait, you're being unjust. And the courts will claim you don't have standing, that you can't press this issue because you're not an appropriate individual. In some cases, there's federal law that's basically given very little rights for the public to press these cases. So it's not bad enough that these agencies don't know what to do. It's that when we show up and say, hey, you made a mistake, they don't even want to acknowledge us. They don't give us standing. And so it's a real problem in terms of getting it. So for instance, the Goethals Bridge I showed you before, I filed against them. I said, you're not doing it. Nora and I wrote up the maps. We said, look, you need a transportation system there. Nope. The person in charge, the group that was in charge is the US Coast Guard, because the federal agency who's charged with solving the civil rights problems in a transportation project? It's typically the highest ranking federal agency. And in the case of the Goethals Bridge, is the Coast Guard, because they're the controllers of the waterways, and it wasn't federal money. So they don't even know they're supposed to do it. I've talked to their people. They're not even sure they're supposed to do it. Okay? Transit systems tend to slough this off. They'll just do transit cuts and they'll change their policies. And they say, well, we're transit, we're good guys, we help everybody. No, not always. So we're going to look at the questions of what are you looking for and what kind of issues can you actually confront with social justice and how do you actually measure it? And that's really my interest, is how do we measure it and how do we use GIS? So we talk about the spending patterns. Okay, I'm going to look at the national, state, and local governments, and obviously what do they spend their dollars on? And I'm going to look to see that these are done equitably, right? And then, of course, obviously the same thing on taxation policy. And a lot of my work has been on tolling systems, toll roads, because my concern is that low-income households have been priced off these roads and have no access to jobs, or actually their shed of jobs is dramatically reduced. So obviously you have a lot of issues out there, and the government will say, you know, they have these problems and they're going to try and deal with them. But the question always comes down to who makes these decisions and who makes these choices, and do they actually put that into the game? So here's a simple one. This is the New York City subway. Nora and I did this map a while back, but the red lines are the New York City subways, and the green lines is the New York City bus system. Now, in the world of transit, buses are the worst. Nobody wants to go on a bus. Nobody. Everybody hates being on the bus. Everybody. But there's a lot of parts of New York City. Now, you'll never see this map. This is a spatially correct map, because the map of the New York City subway system, if you look at it, is massively spatially distorted. They don't even show this eastern part of Queens. Look at how big Queens is past the subway lines. The subway lines stopped growing in 1940 about, and basically these areas have been left behind. Now, this is a map we did a while back, which shows the walk access, half-mile walk access to a subway station. And if you look at a borough like Queens, amazingly enough, and everybody says, oh, New York City, you got great transit system. Yeah, I give New York City an A on general operations on a day-to-day basis, but an F on change and improvement, because they stopped building the subway system in the 1940s, and basically Eastern Queens got left out of it. And I asked Professor Sachs about this, because when you look at our system, I would say now you know where your system improvement should go, which is any place that's on the area uncovered by the subway. You know, the people with 52%, Southeast Brooklyn, Eastern Queens, northern part of the Bronx. These are areas that probably should have gotten investment. Well, that's not what happened, okay? So we have a very complex system, and every time you add something, you should be trying to improve the game. That's kind of my standard, is that every time we do something, it should make the game a little more equitable. It should improve the situation in terms of underserved populations. It should help promote. My comment to everybody is always, I want a flatter city. I want everybody to have access to transit and jobs and to opportunity. So for instance, this is a map we made up of the income of the city. And this is per capita income. And I want you to point out that these houses there are looking at a household. The gray areas are less than $100,000 in household income. And some of them are significantly lower than that. Of course, the red boxes over there are households that have an income per capita, a household income of around $700,000 plus. So you have areas of massive high income areas in the city, and you also have massive areas of moderate and low income areas. And the question is, how well does our system serve these different groups? So here's the commute times map, and I'm going to give you a couple of tips and a couple of points of places you can get data and information. And obviously there's a lot of sources I've been using over the years. But obviously, as Professor Velez highlighted before, you know, there's a lot of exciting things going on out there. And I really encourage any of the young people watching to think about their future and think about how they can see it. Now, the light color indicates a short commute. And what you'll notice is if you go back and look at where the high income people live, they live in a shorter commute world. And that center section of Manhattan is certainly well covered in terms of you know, their performance there. This area here is pretty well served in terms of the commute times are quite low. Whereas other parts of the city are quite dismal. And these are some of the worst commutes in the nation. Ready for this? 1, 2, 3, 4 in terms of the worst commutes in America. Those are the 4 worst commutes in America. Here they are, right here. The average commute time in the outer boroughs, 43 to 45 minutes one way. That's 90 minutes plus round trip. Mass transit commutes, I wish you all the very best. If you're a low-income worker taking mass transit, Staten Island's going to take you almost 70 minutes to get home, one way. Okay, one way. National average is again 25 minutes. Mass transit's a little higher, but certainly we're even higher than national averages. And this is talking about areas where we have very poor transit. So again, we're sitting here and talking about how we're going to invest in our subway system, and the city instead decides to build a subway in the center of Manhattan. And obviously that's the same area right here. That's a very high income area. And you got to ask questions. When we look at what their major investment programs are, they're really focusing on building more and more stuff in some of the richest areas of the city. And I've got to ask who's making these decisions. Things like bike share, maybe it'll help people, right? If you could use a bike, here's our bike share system. And you saw the demographics and income, and you can see that bike share is largely in Manhattan, a little bit of inner Brooklyn and Queens, a little bit of the Bronx. But you know, this is what I get all the time. And I'll be honest with you, I get this all the time from these agencies, which is, we'll do it right the next time. When I point out the problems, they'll say, we'll do it right the next time. Or we'll improve your service, whatever it is, soon. Or we'll help the poor people next time, or we'll extend service, whatever. So again, I've had a number of these cases. We've worked through a number of different ways of doing it. I just want to quickly show you some of the things we've done. We've done analysis of the actual proposals to expand using what's called bus rapid transit, improve quality of bus rapid transit. And the question was, where do you prioritize, right? Extending the system out to serve these unserved communities. And the CUNY mapping service, by the way, if you're interested in demographics, has a lot of fun maps to look at, you know, so you can look at areas with heavy Latino population, heavy African-American population. And of course, obviously the city is very, very diverse in terms of the different neighborhoods. So what gets put in what place? This is in 2010. And again, I agree with Festival as I'm waiting for the 2020 census to see what's happening next. Commute times, you know, again, tremendously troubling that we have our commute times are so long. And, you know, the city then puts in actions like building this ferry system in the city, which in terms of social justice, I think they should have done a lot more work before they decided to make this an expenditure from the public. And let me kick forward. I know we're running out of time. So in terms of investing in the programs, you have to think about who should get the investments. And I use Lorenz curves and Gini coefficients as a way to test for inequality. And the Gini coefficient is a standard economic test that shows you how the spread of costs and income are spread across the society. It's a very useful tool. It's used around the world a lot. And let me just show you an example where we used toll burden, where we took a look at the bridges and tunnels of the MTA. And we punched out and did a demographic profile of who lived near the facility versus who used the facility. And using the typical buffer tool in GIS, we're able to select out census data and also usage data. And what we could actually do is construct the number of households that were in proximity of the facility. And I could tell you whether or not these people are actually able to utilize the facility. These are very, very highly priced facilities. And we were able to then look at who actually uses them and how far they are away from them. This is where it's kind of neat to use geospatial analysis to kind of figure out what's happening in the community. And this is a map, you're not going to see this many places, we made of the burden of tolling by distance from the facility. And what's really interesting is that a lot of the activity, a lot of the costs go out within 30 miles of the facility. So we actually had 44 states in our actual data. We had 44 states, but again, most of the data is heavily weighted towards the close proximity. So when you put in a system where you're going to charge people, who gets hit? People live near it. And then I guess I can finish up here, right? Are we good on time, or we have time, or no? We ready to go? Yes, you're good with 5 minutes, 2 minutes? Okay, so this is 1 minute, okay. So this is one of the data we pulled out, which is really kind of fascinating, which is we pulled out the people who use the bridge. It's a toll bridge. This is the bridges around this New York City that are tolled. They have very high tolls. And we looked at the demographics of people who lived around the bridges, just on the same idea that you were talking about, the burden of, you know, cost of the facility. What we found is a huge percentage of the users of the bridge were high income, 150,000 plus, and a huge percent of the people who lived around the facilities were low and moderate income. And we were fascinated because what happened to these people? How are their mobility needs being met by these facilities? And the answer is, it's not clear they are. And we think that the 33% of the population here that's low-income households living around these facilities are really priced off and just have limited mobility access because of these systems. And again, it's fascinating to look at the actual breakdown. This was actually between two different facilities. This is the Verrazano Bridge, blue, and this is the Queens Midtown Tunnel. The Queens Midtown Tunnel is full of high-income people. And the reason we think that is because people who are poor have to drive around it. They drive over the free bridges in the area. So again, lots of work that can be done. Very exciting area to be in. I'm happy to answer any questions. And that was more than enough for tonight, right? Anybody with an interest, feel free to let me know.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. Yes, we have a couple of questions that I would like to read to you.
Go.
All right, so now with the COVID-19 pushing people to learn new ways of working from home and doing more things remotely, can we see a future where transportation becomes an obsolete factor in reference to economic opportunities?
Well, I think some things, some people, you know, we're going to learn how to avoid certain amount of trips, right? So we may burn off a certain amount of trips, but there are certain jobs. And again, I'm going to focus on, I think a lot of lower income jobs are physical presence jobs. If you're a health aide, if you work at a hospital, you know, there's lots of jobs like that, you know, an auto mechanic, you're going to have to go to your facility. And really what showed up here during COVID-19 when we smacked down and closed the transit system is, wow, what an impact on the non-car households, right? What a huge impact. And you know, what happened was people went out and bought automobiles. Does everybody know that? There was a push to buy automobiles. If you could, you went and bought an automobile. So it's going to be some change, but I think there's going to be a need to still have mobility. And I would say that most households would prefer to have mobility as an option. And transit's nice, but unfortunately, a lot of times the moderate income and low income households are priced out of those areas.
Okay, next question. Has travel time between Staten Island and Manhattan improved with the new express lane for buses on the I-278 cashless tolling?
That would be a 2020 question. It's possible the MTA knows. It's possible they haven't told us. Most of these agencies have a tendency to not release a lot of information. I didn't have a lot of time to go into it, but the data that we actually used, we obtained using the Freedom of Information Act. It's not like the agency published the data. My research crew knew about the data. We submitted a FOIA request. It wasn't like they were willing participants. And the MTA may know what's happening there. I haven't seen anything that tells me about how it's improving. It's the worst commute in the nation, so anything that would help would be great.
All right, and our last question, do you see any way for progressive congestion pricing mechanism to work?
No, I think actually, and I've been working on pricing for years, and congestion pricing was supposed to happen this December, but apparently that's not off. They haven't gotten federal approval. I've been involved with congestion pricing since the first proposal in New York City. It actually has some dimensions that could work. It has to be carefully structured. And one of the elements of that structuring of the pricing system has to be social justice. And in the prior iteration, I can tell you this right now, they had very weak analysis about the social justice impact of who would be priced off the roads. So what I can tell you is, I would recommend you read my paper, just who should pay for what. What we found when we look at the people who would have been priced off the roads, we did a study using existing data systems and sources. We found that basically it was a lot of middle income people. It wasn't the super rich, it wasn't the poor, because the poor don't have cars as frequently as the middle income people. I think it was a lot of working class people who traveled into the city because of their work needs. The other thing we found in the data, which is very, very troubling, if you're going to be paid for your toll by your employer, that tends to be skewed very heavily towards the wealthy.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you for answering all these questions.
My pleasure.
All right, our next presenters, I'm going to introduce two geography students, our very own CSI students, Aurora Collado and Lucina Di Francesco. Both of them are geographers graduating this semester, I believe, next semester. Aurora will speak to us on the topic of Hurricane Sandy and the Build It Back program in Staten Island. And after she finishes, Luciano will talk about the topic of affordable housing in New York City. So please welcome our two student speakers.
Thank you, Professor Santiago. A happy GIS Day to all. All right. My name is Aurora Collado. I'm a fourth-year geography major here at the College of Staten Island. I'm presenting my independent study project. Developed under the mentorship of Dr. Nerv McCaspack, Hurricane Sandy Disaster Response in Richmond County is a GIS project that seeks to understand, firstly, the factors that contributed to the devastation felt by Hurricane Sandy, the disaster response that was put into place to minimize present danger, and what patterns can be identified to prevent or manage future catastrophes. This is a reference map of Staten Island that details what I'll refer to as the hotspot neighborhoods. So we're going to be focusing on Dongan Hills, Midland Beach, and South Beach, as well as the inundation zone inflicted by Hurricane Sandy in reference to residential, commercial buildings, and island parks. In Midland Beach alone, 70% of homes experienced damage, along with most of the East Coastline neighborhoods. This is according to the Department of City Planning in the year 2017. All this data was obtained from NYC Open Data. This is the total number of owned and occupied housing units in Staten Island. This is a 2010 census tract choropleth map with the inundation zone overlaying it. This data was gathered 2 years before Hurricane Sandy took place. Also highlighted in the center is the focus of the Build It Back program, and that's within the translucent eclipse there. It was an incentive and initiative to help establish and rebuild damaged communities, not just in Staten Island, this was across the 5 boroughs. And this was obtained from the US Census Bureau and NYC Open Data. This is the total number of rented housing units. Just a note, the Build It Back program focused primarily on homeowners and the damages that they personally experienced to their property and lives. This is the total white population in Staten Island. So a question I'm looking to answer and that I'm really trying to do analysis on is, were there racial disparities? Were they regarding minorities? The southeast coast of Staten Island was highly built up despite the presence of wetlands, which function as a buffer against rising tides. One question regarding this is who was affected and what are the main populations in this area? Furthering along this pattern, we have the total Black population in Staten Island, the total Hispanic population in Staten Island, and finally, the total population of 65 and over in Staten Island. So something I'm trying to understand is what were the differentials considering regarding the Build It Back program. Finally, I'll be looking at what is the role of wetlands reclamation in preventing future disasters such as Hurricane Sandy and minimizing the damage, and what demographics were made most vulnerable by Hurricane Sandy, and how can we avoid similar problems in the coming years. So I know this is typically at the end, but questions, comments, suggestions, and thank you, geographers. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. Any questions that I might be able to help answer?
We will have Luciana present now, and then we can ask questions at the end. Thank you.
I just want to know, is everyone able to see my screen? Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Luciana DiFrancesco. I'm receiving a bachelor's in geography this semester, and I'm currently an intern at the Department of Housing and Urban Development in the multifamily housing section. And my project today is going to be focused on affordable housing crisis in New York City. So the question that we're going to answer through GIS is, what does housing justice look like in New York City? New York City is known to be the real estate capital of the world. Although this is true, rising rents are disproportionately affecting people of color and of low income. Gentrification is kicking these groups of people out of their neighborhoods by raising rent. And this increases the value of these regions, which is beneficial to developers in the real estate point of view, but it displaces the residents who can no longer afford to live in their homes. So here I created a reference map of NYCHA developments. NYCHA stands for New York City Housing Authority, and they provide affordable housing in the 5 boroughs for low-income residents. We have the least amount of developments on Staten Island. We only have 10, and they're in the North Shore. And we have the most in Manhattan. We have 101, and they're located mostly on the Lower East Side and Upper Manhattan. And for this presentation, we're solely going to be focusing on just Manhattan. So here I created a chloropleth map of NYCHA and African American population in Manhattan. As you could see, there's many NYCHA developments where there are a heavy African American population in Upper Manhattan. Next, we have NYCHA and white population in Manhattan. They're mostly concentrated on the Lower East Side, and there's a few in Upper Manhattan, but not as many as the African American population. And we also have NYCHA and Latino population in Manhattan. The Latino population in this borough is scattered throughout. As we could see, there's a lot in Upper Manhattan and the Lower East Side where there are NYCHA developments. And a fact I'd like to point out for the demographics of NYCHA housing in general are 46% of the residents are Black, 44% are Hispanic, and 4% are white. Next, we have NYCHA and renter-occupied housing units in Manhattan. As you could see, where there's NYCHA housing, we have a lot of renter-occupied housing units, and we could say the opposite for this map that shows NYCHA and owner-occupied housing units in Manhattan. The owner-occupied housing units have little to no NYCHA housing in the areas that they're located. And through GIS, we're able to find the relation of race and affordable housing, as well as what efforts are being made of fixing this crisis. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aurora and Luciana. Wonderful presentation. It's always so nice to see our student present because you guys are the future. All right, our last presenter for tonight is Kristen McNara-Watts. She's the GIS manager at the City of Asheville, North Carolina. Kristen has a master's degree in geospatial information systems, science and technology from the North Carolina State University and the BS from the University of Vermont. In 2019, the City of Asheville won the J. Herbert Stout Award for Innovation in GIS for their work mapping racial equity. Kristen has presented locally and nationally about advancing racial equity and justice through spatial analysis and is currently working on a climate equity and justice project in Asheville with the city's Office of Sustainability. Please welcome Kristen McNara-Watts.
Thank you. Everyone can see my screen? Great, thanks. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor and I've enjoyed the presentation so much. I'm Kristen Watts. I'm the GIS manager for the City of Asheville, so local government. I'm excited to share about our work in Asheville using GIS as a tool to advance equity and racial equity. And I'd like to acknowledge before I get started that as a white person, I have benefited from some of the racist policies that I'm going to speak about. So what is equity? I know we've talked about it a lot this evening, but I just want to kind of say that equity is recognizing that not everyone begins with the same place or that has the same opportunities or obstacles, and some folks might need something different or more than others. In January 2016, the Asheville City Council created a 20-year vision for the city, which included the statement, "Cultural diversity and social economic equity are evident in all that we do." So we are directed by council to make sure that our citizens are given equity as an opportunity. So getting to know Asheville. Asheville is a small city in the mountains of Western North Carolina, about 92,000 people. It's located on the traditional territory of the Salagaweti, which are known now as the Eastern Band of Cherokee. Asheville is located at the confluence of two rivers, flowing south to north. This large river here is the French Broad, which is an important river. It's one of the oldest rivers in the world. And flowing east to west is the Swananoa River, and we're located at the confluence in the middle, downtown. I'd like to start talking about some demographics about Asheville. And I just want to kind of mention that I'm going to try to keep my language to match the data source. And I know language is important. Oh no, my battery is running low. There we go. Sorry about that. And I did use 2010 census because that's where I can get the full count within Asheville city limits. So Asheville in 2010 was about 79.3% white, and Black or African American is the largest minority by percentage at 13.4%. And with census data, we have race and then we have ethnicity. So I want to mention that Asheville is 6.5% Hispanic or Latino of any race. There are significant economic and educational gaps in Asheville between Asheville's community and Black and African American households. And I just want to point out that between the state and Asheville as a whole, there's already a gap of about, for median household income of about $4,000. But then when you look at Black households in Asheville, there's a $12,000 gap between all households and Black households. And then when we look at Black women, the gap is even larger, where the median income for Black women is $14,000, and Black women below, there's 39% of Black women are below the poverty line. And when you look at single Black mothers, it's 61%. These are kind of staggering numbers. When we look at education gaps, this graph, I know it's a little hard to see, is for Asheville City schools, and this is end of grade testing, so at the end of the year for grades 3 through 8. The blue line is white students in Asheville City schools. The red line is white students across the state. The green line is Black students in the state, and the yellow line is Black students in Asheville. So between the state and Asheville for Black students, there's a 16.8% gap for Asheville students. When we look at between white students in Asheville and Black students in Asheville, there's almost a 60% gap in their achievement for end of grade testing. That's a problem. When we look at high school, we get a different story. Even though we see these gaps in educational achievement, the graduation rates aren't matching. So it's telling a different story. This is really upsetting, and as a community, we're trying to focus on this. I'm gonna go back into history, some history about race in Asheville now, and talk about redlining. Some of you may know about redlining, but in the 30s and 40s, during the New Deal, the Homeowners Loan Corporation recruited mortgage lenders and developers to actually map out, like take pens and map out areas of credit worthiness and color coded them. So they went from A to D. A is the green on this map. It's kind of the north and south areas of Asheville. This almost looks like our city limits. We're a little bigger than this now. And those areas did not only have the highest credit worthiness, there were restrictions on there by race. The areas of red and yellow are the failing areas. They considered hazardous to loan money, and it wasn't just to loan money to build. It was like loan money to do your renovations on your house. So it led to blight. And actually, I want to show you one of the documents. This is one of the HLC documents. I know it's very hard to read. And this is for area D1, which is right in the center of town. And you can see reasons for calling this area hazardous is infiltration of Negro gradually. And I just want to say that this was a government policy. Like, this is explicit racism. And in 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed. But at that point, there had been generations of people that hadn't been given opportunities to own homes, and there's no way to catch up. As we go on, I just want to point out that home ownership in the United States is the #1 way to generate wealth and pass wealth on. The next map is about displacement. So this map here, the points are actually people. The reddish, I guess the kind of pink points are negative. So these are people, these are African American people in Asheville that have left, and it's done by census tracts, who have left from 2010 to 2015. And the blue are positive migration, so African Americans who have moved into different areas. There's a giant red dot in the middle, and this area here is called the Montford neighborhood, and this is actually 435 people. So between those 5 years, 435 people have left that census tract. And Montford's a historically African American neighborhood. I had to do the math like 3 times because I couldn't believe it. I just want to point out that from this map, at first glance, you see that there's some migration out of the center of Asheville, and that's like the downtown area. There's a lot of economic opportunity in downtown. There's transportation, there's jobs, there's grocery stores, there's stuff going on. It's cute, you should come visit. But housing is very expensive, and it's getting more expensive. But this helps us at like a neighborhood level kind of start to explore what's happening. In the next map, this is the map of neighborhood change. So Los Angeles developed this methodology for neighborhood change, and they were kind enough to share with me how they did it, and I decided to try it in Asheville, because I know a lot of people talk about, oh, Asheville's changing, and this neighborhood is this, and this. But when you have the data to prove or disprove what's going on, you can, make policies that affect those people. In this map, the red areas have had the most change, and orange, where the yellow and green are the least amount of change. And I'll show you, I know I'm going really fast, but we're running low on time. The weighted measures used for this study here were percent change in low to high income, median household income, median household size, change in percentage of white, non-Hispanic, education, and percent change in median gross rent, which I don't know about where you live, but rent does not go down. So this is definitely like change in rent increases. But what we can, looking at these neighborhoods, we can, and seeing which are more vulnerable to change, it might give us some ideas about what's going on, and we're using data that we can actually prove it. Neighborhoods with high change indexes could be vulnerable to gentrification or have already experienced it. Gentrification is renovating or improving a house or neighborhood district so that it conforms to the middle class taste. Gentrification, can have a really high cost to people of color and or lower income residents if they become displaced because they're priced out. Maybe they've lost their community and connections, or maybe the neighborhood just is no longer affordable at all for them. Asheville makes a lot of top 10 lists. This, unfortunately, in 2017 was one of them, where Asheville was ranked the 2nd fastest gentrifying city in the country. In this article, it listed that a home price in 2000, the median home price was $125,000. And I showed you the median household income, so you know that kind of lines up a little. In 2015, it went from 125 to 235,000, which is an 88% increase over 15 years. Looking at household income between that same time period, that only increased 28%. So something is going on here. And when you think back to like how the policies have like explicitly denied African Americans housing opportunities, and then you look at how gentrification is causing home prices to rise, we're able to learn a lot. So where does GIS fit in? Well, if we're able to use data to make decisions, then we're able to help create policies that are better for our community. I know we're focusing a lot on the education gap, and we're on. Let me go into this map here. So this map should kind of look familiar. It's just overlay of the, you'll see the redlining areas, the yellow and the red. These are the outlined area polygons. And then we have the point data that is displacement. So that's a negative displacement. And then the polygons that are colored are yellow, or I'm sorry, orange and red. Those are the neighborhoods with the highest indices of change. So things are happening, change is happening there the fastest. When we put these three layers on top of each other, immediately you're drawn back to that giant red circle. And when that was that Montfort area, and you see that it has redlining, high displacement, and high neighborhood change, and you know that this is an area that could be very vulnerable. So from this, we're able to learn about where we need to, when we're thinking about equity, like where do people live, the who behind the where. So we've been doing some work with also with urban renewal. The city just a few weeks ago decided not to sell any parcels that we own as a city that were acquired during urban renewal, and we're in the process of mapping those out right now. We've had some students help us mapping African American landmarks that were lost during urban renewal. I've got some information from other schools here too. I did want to bring up the city data resource that we have. The city of Asheville is a member of GARE, which is the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And we use their equity toolkit, which is a set of questions kind of asking when you're thinking of a policy or a program or trying to make a decision that affects your community, it's questions about who will be affected, who will be burdened, who are your stakeholders, who's not included, to try to get you an idea of help you make the decision better. And a lot of this is data heavy. So we built out this mapping series, it's a familiar Esri map that gets that data to you in your fingertips, so they can go through information about the where and figure out the who. We have been doing a lot of, like over the last 2 years, been doing a lot of equity analysis, or including equity in our analysis. This is an example of broadband during COVID, looking for what students were lacking broadband. And this analysis led to our parks. We prioritized using BIPOC population who didn't have access to broadband. We used redlining, and we were able to prioritize areas that needed broadband assistance. And we started with our parks. So the parks located in those areas have beefed up or were given free Wi-Fi, and community centers too. We've been using equity to look at our capital spending, like where are our dollars going and who is benefiting and who's not benefiting. So I know you're talking about local government making decisions, and they have the capital to spend, but using equity data in making those decisions will hopefully prevent more damage. We have used GIS with our police transparency, opening data, but I do want to just kind of, as a call to action, just kind of let you know that that GIS is a really important tool, and I'm really proud to get to work on projects like this and integrate it into everything we do, from sidewalks to affordable housing to capital projects. It's been a really beneficial tool for us. It's great to use data to make good decisions and see some successes, like the policy change for parcels that were acquired during urban renewal. And with our new resolutions for reparations, I can see that we'll probably be doing more work. Great. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Kristen. So what I would like the audience to put the questions in the chat for Kristen. While we're waiting for those questions to come in, there are some questions for the students. The first question is going to be for Aurora. So please unmute yourself. Let me find out what's going on in this chat.
Would you like me to read the question as well, or go right to the answer?
Let me just find it.
Thank you.
I give it to you. Okay. So given sea level rise, do you think relocation to high grounds is better than the Build It Back program?
So in a perfect world, the answer might be perhaps. There would be economic consequences. There would definitely be resistance from the population. Total reclamation of the wetlands might certainly be preferable given tidal rise, especially considering the climate change and the reality of that. We would have to be careful with, I think, relocation funds and opportunities and have an access plan so we wouldn't be disadvantaging vulnerable populations. So maybe gradually over the course of several decades, we can aim to achieve that. The Build It Back program is an immediate solution, but I completely understand your concern that perhaps rebuilding might not be in our best interest. And that's definitely something I'm looking into.
Thank you so much, Aurora. All right, the next question is for Luciana. From your research, what one thing do you want the next mayor of New York City to know when they take office in January 2022?
Well, I would definitely want the next mayor to prioritize creating more affordable housing and to protect neighborhoods and developments from being gentrified, because it's a major issue that's displacing people. Waiting lists are too long to get in affordable housing right now. There's millions of people on lists, and it could take years in order to get the affordable housing. Many people aren't promised it, so I just feel like it's a very big issue that should be looked into, because it's a main concern for millions of people in the city to afford housing. Housing is a right for everyone, and it's just not fair how some people aren't able to achieve it.
Very good. Thank you so much, Luciana. All right, Kristen, I have some questions for you. Do you see that design charrettes as a way to engage the public in participatory GIS?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part.
Do you see design charrettes as a way to engage the public in participatory GIS?
Ooh, I'm not sure what that is.
So those are usually community, small groups that get together in the community,
Yeah.
where they actually use GIS, utilize it to help the residents understand what the change will be for the community.
Well, we are a pretty small city. We do have community engagement. We're like right now, what we're doing with our climate justice initiative is they're called story circles. And so for those, I was going to share, but we're giving people, we've built out a map app for them to be able to look and see like climate threats in their area. And we created an index of a score for them, and then letting them see through the maps and then gathering their stories. And then eventually we'll take their stories into building out our plan. I hope that's a good answer to that.
Sure. Another question, how much of the work you do towards the goal of equity in the provision of public schools is constrained by the lack of tax dollars to pay for it?
That's another really good question. So we're not exactly, our city schools are its own organization. We support them, and our city manager is really influential in that. So we support them mostly through our community centers and rec centers. And we're just trying to be really creative, using things like Chromebooks and things that are more affordable, and offering hotspots and what we can do. And we're working on it. I'd be really, I mean, with COVID too, like there's a lot going on right now.
Thank you very much. If there's any other questions? Okay, let me just look at the chat. No, I think that was all. So I just want to conclude this event and thanking everyone who attended this two-day event. This is the first time that we did 2 days of GIS, and I think we can do more. I don't know, let's talk about it next year, right? And thank you for all the speakers and everyone who attended. I would like to thank you, all the people in the background who helped organize this event, constantly talking to everyone about GIS and how much we would like people to come and see what GIS can do. And I would like to thank you, the administration, for their support, President Fritz, Rob Wallace, our VP for Economic Development, Continuing Studies, and Government Relations, Jasmine Cardona, Executive Director, and most of all, Ishmael Hassan. He's done so much for us, the technical support, the marketing, the design. I can go on and on. Couldn't do it without you, Ishmael. But I have one more very important message. GIS Day is every year, all right? So write this down. Next year, GIS Day is November 17, 2021. Hopefully in person, but if not, virtually, we will see each other. And thank you so much for coming, and have a good night. Thank you.